Racist cop assaults black woman in courtroom. She never raises her voice. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Hey Quay Lai Voi Nan Vat Chin. Alyssa Carter stood just inside the wooden rail of the courtroom, her posture steady, her hands folded calmly at her waist, as if she had practiced this moment 1,000 times in her mind. The room was quiet in the way only courtrooms ever were, heavy with the low hum of fluorescent lights and the faint creak of benches as people shifted in their seats. Alyssa did not look around. She did not need to. She could feel the attention pressing in on her from every direction, the weight of unspoken assumptions lingering in the air. Across the aisle, Officer Daniel Whitmore adjusted his stance, his uniform crisp, his presence filling more space than necessary, as though the badge on his chest granted him ownership of the room itself. His eyes lingered on Alyssa longer than they should have, not with curiosity, but with judgment sharpened by certainty. He cleared his throat, the sound cutting through the silence, and spoke with an authority that assumed compliance before it was ever earned. Alyssa did not respond. She kept her gaze forward, focused on the judge's bench, on the seal carved into the wood, on anything that was not the man standing a few feet away testing the limits of his power. A murmur rippled through the spectators, subtle enough to deny, loud enough to feel. Whitmore shifted closer, his tone edged with impatience, his words carefully chosen to remind her who he believed was in control. He gestured toward the open space beside the rail, as if directing traffic, as if moving a person were no different from rearranging furniture. Still, Alyssa did not raise her voice. She did not flinch. She moved only when necessary, each step measured, each breath slow, the kind of restraint that comes not from fear, but from resolve. To Whitmore, her silence read as defiance. To others, it looked like surrender. But beneath the surface, something else was happening, something quieter and far more dangerous to those who mistook calm for weakness. Alyssa had learned long ago that rooms like this one often decided who was believed before a single word was spoken, that respect was rarely offered freely, and that dignity, once lost, was almost impossible to reclaim. Today, she intended to keep hers intact. Whitmore spoke again, his voice rising just enough to draw the judge's attention, his posture squared as if inviting agreement from the system around him. Papers rustled. A pen tapped once, then stopped. Alyssa felt the moment stretch, the tension tightening like a held breath, and still she remained composed. She did not explain herself. She did not plead. She simply stood there, present, unyielding, allowing the weight of the moment to settle where it belonged. In that silence, something shifted, not yet visibly, not enough for Whitmore to notice, but enough to change the air. Alyssa's stillness became a mirror, reflecting every glance, every assumption, every quiet complicity in the room. She was not there to argue. She was there to endure, to observe, and to let the truth, when it arrived, speak louder than any raised voice ever could. Alyssa remained where she was as the judge called for order, the sound of the gavel echoing softly through the chamber like a reminder of rules that were supposed to apply to everyone equally. The courtroom settled into a strained quiet, the kind that made every breath feel audible. Rows of wooden benches stretched behind her, filled with strangers whose eyes carried a mix of curiosity, doubt, and practiced indifference. Some leaned forward as if they were watching a performance. Others stared straight ahead, unwilling to acknowledge the moment unfolding in front of them. The courthouse itself felt older than the people inside it, its high ceilings and pale stone walls holding decades of whispered judgments and forgotten truths. Sunlight filtered in through tall windows, catching dust in the air, illuminating a space meant to symbolize fairness while often revealing its absence. Officer Daniel Whitmore took a half step back, not out of restraint, but because he believed the moment had passed in his favor. His shoulders were squared, his expression set with the confidence of someone who had never been seriously questioned in this room. He folded his hands behind his back, adopting the posture of patience, as though he were granting Alyssa time rather than taking it from her. He expected a reaction, an explanation, perhaps even an apology. What he received instead was silence. Alyssa stood with the same composed stillness, her gaze level, her breathing slow and deliberate. She understood the unspoken rules of places like this, how quickly a single word spoken too loudly could be labeled as disrespect, how calm could be misread as compliance, and how dignity often came at a cost. She had learned to pay that cost willingly. The judge glanced down at the file on the bench, flipping a page with measured care, while the court clerk adjusted her glasses and typed quietly, the clicking keys sounding louder than they should have. Somewhere in the gallery, a cough broke the silence, followed by the scrape of a shoe against the floor. Whitmore cleared his throat again, his voice firm but edged with impatience as he addressed the judge, framing the situation as routine, unremarkable, already resolved in his mind. His words carried an assumption that the room would follow his lead, that authority, once declared, needed no further proof. Alyssa listened without reacting, not because she agreed, but because she was listening for something else, something beneath the surface. She noticed the subtle shift in the judge's expression, the slight pause before a sentence continued, the way a few heads in the gallery tilted as if reassessing what they were witnessing. The silence she held was not empty. It was deliberate. It gave space for others to hear themselves think. It allowed the imbalance to reveal itself without commentary. Alyssa knew that the courtroom thrived on order, and order depended on expectations. When expectations were disrupted, even quietly, the system faltered. She had seen it before, had watched confidence dissolve when it was no longer echoed by the room. Whitmore glanced at her again, irritation flickering across his face when she still did not respond. He shifted his weight, adjusting his stance, unaware that the smallest cracks were beginning to form. Alyssa remained steady, her presence unchanging, a calm center in a space accustomed to noise and control. She did not need to raise her voice. She was already being heard, even if no one was ready to admit it yet. Alyssa Carter had learned long. Before that, courtrooms were less about truth and more about posture, less about facts and more about who was believed before a word was spoken. As she stood there, she felt the familiar weight of that understanding settle into her shoulders, not as a burden, but as a quiet reminder. Her life had taught her how quickly moments could turn when authority went unchecked, how easily calm could be mistaken for weakness, and how often dignity was tested in spaces that claimed to protect it. She did not look at Officer Daniel Whitmore again. Instead, her eyes remained fixed on the judge's bench, steady and unblinking, as if anchoring herself to the idea that the room still had rules, even if they were being bent. The judge adjusted his glasses, scanning the paperwork before him, his brow tightening slightly as he read. He had presided over thousands of cases, had seen countless defendants stand where Alyssa stood now, but something about her composure disrupted the rhythm he was used to. She was not nervous in the way most people were. She was not rehearsing excuses or scanning the room for reassurance. She simply existed there, fully present, as though she belonged. Whitmore noticed it too, though he would not have named it as such. He sensed a shift he could not control, an absence of the reactions he expected. His confidence had always relied on predictable responses, raised voices, hurried explanations, visible discomfort. Alyssa gave him none of that. The courtroom clerk cleared her throat softly, continuing to type, the sound echoing through the silence like a ticking clock. Alyssa's hands remained folded, her fingers relaxed, her breathing even. She thought of all the times she had been advised to speak up, to defend herself immediately, to match force with volume. She had learned instead that timing mattered more than volume, that restraint could carry its own authority. The gallery watched closely now, attention sharpening. A woman in the second row leaned back, arms crossed, her expression shifting from curiosity to concern. A man near the aisle, stopped tapping his foot, his gaze lingering on Alyssa longer than before. These were small changes, almost invisible, but Alyssa felt them. Silence had a way of amplifying observation. Whitmore spoke again, his voice firm, attempting to restore the dynamic he believed was slipping. He framed his words carefully, choosing language that sounded procedural, official, beyond question. He assumed the judge would nod, that the room would move on. But the judge hesitated, just for a second, eyes lifting from the file to Alyssa's face. In that pause, the air seemed to thicken. Alyssa met the judge's gaze calmly, not challengingly, simply present. She did not need to say who she was or why she was there. Not yet. Her silence invited the court to confront itself. The judge inhaled slowly, his hand resting on the bench as he considered the moment. He was aware of the room, of the weight of expectation, of the eyes now fixed on him. Whitmore shifted again, a subtle movement that betrayed his growing unease. Alyssa remained still. She had learned that moments like this were fragile, easily disrupted by impatience. She allowed it to unfold naturally, trusting the process she had committed herself to. Whatever happened next would not be rushed. The courtroom, accustomed to noise and command, waited. And in that waiting, Alyssa held her ground, her silence steady, her presence undeniable, letting the imbalance reveal itself without her ever having to raise her voice. A subtle tension settled deeper into the courtroom as the judge finally spoke again, his voice measured, careful, as though he sensed that this moment carried more weight than it appeared. He asked a procedural question, one that should have been routine, yet it hung in the air longer than expected. Officer Daniel Whitmore answered quickly, his tone clipped, confident, reinforcing his version of events with practiced ease. He had told similar stories before, framed situations in ways that left little room for challenge. His posture suggested the matter was already decided. Alyssa Carter listened without reacting, her expression unchanged, her silence continuing to unsettle the rhythm Whitmore relied on. The judge nodded slowly, but did not immediately respond, his fingers resting against the edge of the bench as he studied the room. The pause felt intentional. The courtroom clerk glanced up from her screen, her eyes flicking between the judge and Alyssa, sensing that something was not following its usual course. A quiet murmur spread again among the spectators, more noticeable now, less restrained. People shifted in their seats, their attention sharpening as they realized this was no longer a predictable exchange. Whitmore noticed it too. He straightened, clearing his throat, repeating himself with slightly more emphasis, as if volume alone could reassert control. His words carried an edge now, impatience creeping in, frustration leaking through the polished surface of authority. Alyssa remained still. Her calm did not waver. She had endured moments like this before, moments when pressure increased in subtle ways, when authority tested how far it could go without being questioned. She understood that escalation did not always come with raised voices or overt actions. Sometimes it came through tone, through implication, through the expectation that silence would eventually crack. She did not allow it to. The judge's gaze returned to Alyssa, his expression unreadable. He asked her a simple question, one that invited a response, perhaps even demanded it. The room leaned in, waiting. Alyssa inhaled slowly, her shoulders rising and falling almost imperceptibly. She answered with a brief, respectful acknowledgement, her voice low and steady, offering no explanation beyond what was necessary. She did not defend herself. She did not accuse anyone. She simply confirmed her presence and her willingness to comply with the court's process. The simplicity of her response seemed to disrupt expectations even further. Whitmore frowned slightly, his jaw tightening as he glanced toward the judge, clearly dissatisfied. He interjected again, attempting to steer the exchange back into familiar territory, framing Alyssa's restraint as avoidance, her calm as inconvenience. The judge raised a hand gently, signaling him to wait. That small gesture shifted the balance of the room. It was subtle, but unmistakable. Whitmore hesitated, something he rarely did, then stepped back half an inch, his confidence no longer as seamless as before. Alyssa noticed the change, though she did not acknowledge it outwardly. She kept her eyes forward, her posture unchanged, allowing the system to confront its own imbalance. The spectators watched in near silence now, the earlier murmurs fading into focused attention. A few faces reflected discomfort, others curiosity, as though they were witnessing an unfamiliar dynamic unfold. Alyssa understood that escalation did not always mean force. Sometimes it meant exposure. Every attempt Whitmore made to assert dominance only highlighted the contrast between his agitation and her composure. The judge leaned back slightly, considering the exchange, the atmosphere in the room shifting from routine to something more deliberate. The courtroom, once predictable and controlled, now felt suspended in a fragile moment of reckoning. Alyssa remained at its center, not by choice, but by presence alone, allowing the tension to build naturally, trusting that escalation, when met with restraint, often revealed more than any argument ever could. The courtroom seemed to breathe differently now, as if the space itself sensed that something subtle had been set in motion. The judge leaned forward slightly, reviewing the documents before him with a renewed focus, his fingers lingering on certain pages longer than before. Alyssa Carter noticed it immediately, not with satisfaction, but with quiet awareness. She had learned to read rooms the way others read faces, picking up on pauses, on hesitations, on the unspoken language of systems beginning to question themselves. On the bench beside her rested a slim folder, unremarkable in appearance, its edges worn from use rather than neglect. It had been placed there earlier without ceremony, unnoticed by most, yet it carried a weight far heavier than its size suggested. Alyssa had not touched it since entering the courtroom. She did not need to. Its presence alone was enough. Officer Daniel Whitmore shifted again, his movements no longer as controlled as before. He glanced briefly at the folder, then away, dismissing it as irrelevant, as something that did not concern him. His attention returned to the judge, his expression tightening as the questions grew more precise, more carefully framed. Each inquiry peeled back a layer of assumption, not aggressively, but methodically. Whitmore answered, choosing his words with increasing care, aware now that the room was listening differently. Alyssa remained still, her gaze forward, her posture unchanged. She felt the tension ripple outward, touching the spectators who now watched with intent rather than curiosity. A man seated near the back adjusted his tie, his eyes narrowing slightly. A woman beside him clasped her hands together, leaning forward as if unwilling to miss a single word. The clerk paused her typing for just a moment, then resumed, the sound steady, deliberate. Alyssa understood that moments like this were built on details most people overlooked. A timeline that did not quite align. A report that used familiar language too precisely. A witness name repeated more than necessary. None of it was dramatic on its own, but together they formed a pattern. She had spent years learning how patterns emerged, how systems revealed themselves through repetition rather than confession. The judge asked another question, this one directed not at Alyssa, but at Whitmore, referencing a procedural step taken earlier that day. Whitmore hesitated just briefly before responding. The hesitation did not go unnoticed. Alyssa felt it like a shift in temperature, subtle but undeniable. Her silence continued to serve its purpose, allowing others to notice what she did not point out. She had learned that truth often carried more weight when discovered than when declared. The folder beside her remained untouched, its contents waiting for the right moment, the moment when the room would be ready to understand them. Alyssa had not come to force anything. She had come to observe, to endure, and to allow the process to unfold as it always did when pressure met restraint. Whitmore cleared his throat, attempting to regain momentum, but the judge raised a hand again, slower this time, signaling for patience. The gesture was small, but its effect was immediate. Whitmore stepped back, his confidence now visibly strained. Alyssa kept her eyes forward, her breathing even, her presence grounded. She knew the importance of letting the system reach its own conclusions. In the gallery, the earlier murmurs did not return. The room was fully engaged now, drawn into a quiet unraveling that did not rely on spectacle. Alyssa stood at the center of it, not speaking, not reacting, allowing the details she had planned to do what they were meant to do. The courtroom waited, suspended in a moment where silence had become the loudest voice of all. As the courtroom remained suspended in that charged quiet, Alyssa Carter allowed her thoughts to drift inward, not away from the moment, but deeper into it. She had learned long ago how to stand still while everything inside her moved with purpose. Years of experience had taught her that moments like this were never isolated. They were the result of patterns repeated over time, of systems that grew comfortable when they were not challenged. She remembered the first time she had stood in a room where authority was assumed to be unquestionable, how quickly calm observation had revealed what force never could. Today felt familiar in that way. The judge continued to review the documents before him, his attention now drawn to details that had once seemed routine. Alyssa noticed the shift in his posture, the way his shoulders tightened slightly as he reread a line, the pause before he turned a page. These were signs of reconsideration, of a process no longer on autopilot. Officer Daniel Whitmore stood quietly now, his earlier certainty replaced by a guarded stillness. He watched the judge closely, trying to anticipate what would come next, unaware that anticipation itself had become a vulnerability. Alyssa kept her gaze steady, her expression neutral, offering no indication of what she knew or why she was there. She had learned the value of patience, of allowing others to arrive at conclusions they believed were their own. Her silence was not empty. It was informed. She thought back to the preparation that had led her here, the long hours spent studying procedures, timelines, and reports, not to memorize them, but to understand how they fit together. She had seen how authority often relied on repetition rather than accuracy, how confidence could mask inconsistency. The folder beside her contained nothing dramatic, nothing sensational, just records aligned carefully against one another, small discrepancies that became undeniable when viewed as a whole. She had chosen this moment deliberately, knowing that a courtroom accustomed to speed and certainty would struggle with restraint. The gallery watched with growing focus, sensing that something important was unfolding even if they could not yet name it. Alyssa felt their attention not as pressure, but as acknowledgement. She had learned that being seen did not require speaking, that presence alone could disrupt long-standing assumptions. The judge looked up again, his eyes lingering on Alyssa for a fraction longer than before. There was no accusation in his gaze, no sympathy either, only consideration. He asked another measured question, his tone neutral, directed toward the process rather than the person. Whitmore answered, his voice steady but slightly strained, each word chosen carefully now. Alyssa listened, not for what was said, but for what was missing. Silence filled the gaps where certainty once lived. She remained composed, her breathing slow, her stance unchanged. She knew that this phase of the moment was crucial, the quiet turning inward before revelation, the space where truth gathered strength. She did not rush it. She trusted it. The clerk continued typing, her pace even, her eyes occasionally flicking upward, registering the shift in tone. The courtroom, once dominated by expectation, now felt balanced on a question rather than an answer. Alyssa held her ground, not as an act of defiance, but as an act of faith in process, in restraint, in the idea that justice, when given time, had a way of correcting itself. She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. Everything that mattered was already being heard. The shift happened quietly, almost imperceptibly, the way significant moments often did when they were not announced. The judge closed the folder he had been reviewing and set it aside, his hands resting flat on the bench as he looked up, no longer scanning the room, but focusing on Alyssa Carter with deliberate attention. The courtroom felt suddenly smaller, as if the walls had drawn closer to witness what came next. Alyssa met the judge's gaze calmly, her expression unchanged, her posture steady. She had waited for this moment, not with anticipation, but with certainty. The judge spoke again, his voice measured, his words chosen with care, asking a question that reached beyond procedure and into context. He referenced the materials before him, the timeline, the discrepancies that no longer aligned neatly. He did not accuse. He did not assume. He asked for clarification. Alyssa responded by doing something she had not done all day. She reached for the folder beside her. The movement was slow, deliberate, respectful of the space she stood in. The simple act drew every eye in the room. She opened the folder and removed a single document, holding it out with both hands before placing it gently on the rail. Her voice, when she spoke, was calm and even, clear enough to be heard without effort. She identified herself fully, not with flourish or pride, but with precision, stating her role, her authority, and the capacity in which she was present. The effect was immediate. A ripple moved through the gallery, not loud, but unmistakable. The judge's expression changed, his posture straightening as he took in her words, then the document. He examined it closely, his eyes scanning lines that carried weight far beyond the paper itself. Officer Daniel Whitmore stiffened, his attention snapping toward Alyssa, disbelief flashing across his face before he could contain it. He opened his mouth as if to speak, then stopped, uncertainty replacing the confidence he had relied on all morning. The judge looked up again, his gaze firm now, no longer tentative. He addressed Whitmore directly, referencing Alyssa's credentials, her jurisdiction, the scope of her involvement. Each word landed with quiet authority. The room held its breath. Whitmore struggled to respond, his voice steady in tone, but lacking its earlier assurance. The judge raised a hand, signaling him to wait. He turned back to Alyssa, asking for confirmation, for clarity, for context. Alyssa answered succinctly, providing only what was necessary, her voice never rising, her demeanor never shifting. She explained that her presence in the courtroom was intentional, that the events of the day had been documented as part of a broader review, and that her silence had been a choice, not an absence. The judge nodded slowly, absorbing the implications. The courtroom felt transformed, the power dynamics rearranged without spectacle or force. Whitmore stood frozen, the weight of realization settling over him as the room recalibrated around a truth he had not anticipated. Alyssa remained composed, her hands returning to rest at her sides, her role now clear without needing emphasis. The judge spoke again, his tone firm, outlining next steps with precision, ensuring that process, once ignored, was now unmistakably present. The spectators watched in silence, understanding they had witnessed a reversal not born of confrontation, but of clarity. Alyssa did not smile. She did not seek acknowledgement. She simply stood there, having allowed the truth to arrive on its own terms. She had never raised her voice. She had not needed to. The truth had spoken clearly enough. The courtroom settled into a different kind of quiet after the truth had been placed on the record, a quiet shaped not by uncertainty but by consequence. The judge adjusted his posture, his voice now carrying a firmness that left little room for interpretation as he outlined the immediate steps that would follow. Procedures that had once felt optional were suddenly precise, deliberate, and unavoidable. Officer Daniel Whitmore stood rigid near the aisle, his earlier authority stripped of momentum, replaced by a visible effort to maintain composure. He listened as his role was clarified, as boundaries were drawn clearly where he had once assumed freedom. There was no spectacle, no raised voices, only the steady enforcement of rules that applied equally now. Alyssa Carter observed without reaction, her expression calm, her focus unwavering. She had not come for vindication, and she did not seek satisfaction in the shift unfolding around her. The judge addressed the court with careful language, emphasizing accountability, process, and the importance of conduct within the very space designed to uphold fairness. Each word reinforced a message that did not need repetition. Whitmore was instructed to step aside from his duties pending further review, the decision delivered with professionalism rather than judgment. The instruction landed heavily, not because it was dramatic, but because it was final. Whitmore complied, nodding stiffly, his movements measured as he followed direction rather than giving it. The gallery watched in silence, absorbing the transformation of authority they had witnessed without interruption. Alyssa remained where she was, hands relaxed at her sides, her presence steady. She did not look toward Whitmore. She did not need to. The process spoke for itself. The judge turned to Alyssa again, thanking her for her cooperation and clarity, acknowledging the role restraint had played in allowing the matter to unfold properly. His words were formal, but there was a note of respect beneath them, recognition earned not through force, but through discipline. Alyssa responded briefly, her voice even, confirming her understanding and her continued commitment to the process ahead. She did not elaborate. She did not explain her silence. It no longer required explanation. The clerk recorded the proceedings meticulously, each keystroke marking a moment that would be referenced long after the room emptied. Spectators shifted, some exchanging quiet glances, others sitting still, as if reluctant to disturb what they had just witnessed. The courtroom no longer felt tense. It felt recalibrated. Alyssa sensed the release of pressure, the subtle easing that followed resolution. She understood that this was not an ending, but a correction, a necessary realignment within a system that too often resisted it. As the judge prepared to adjourn the session, he reminded the room of its purpose, of the responsibility carried by those who operated within it. His words echoed softly against the high walls, lingering longer than the sound itself. Whitmore stood aside now, no longer central, no longer directing attention. Alyssa remained composed, her role complete for the moment. When the session concluded, there was no applause, no outward reaction, only the quiet acknowledgement of something having shifted. Alyssa turned calmly and began to walk toward the exit, her steps unhurried, her posture unchanged. She passed through the aisle as spectators made space without being asked, their eyes following her with a new understanding. She had not raised her voice. She had not demanded recognition. She had allowed the truth to take its place, and in doing so, she had let accountability speak louder than any confrontation ever could. The hallway outside the courtroom felt quieter than Alyssa Carter expected, the polished floor reflecting the overhead lights as people moved past her with subdued purpose. She paused near a tall window where afternoon sunlight filtered through, casting long lines across the stone walls. Inside the courtroom, the echoes of procedure and authority had settled. But here, in the space between rooms, the moment finally had room to breathe. Alyssa stood still, her reflection faint in the glass, and allowed herself a single measured breath. The weight she carried was not relief, nor triumph, but clarity. She understood that what had unfolded was not about one officer or one courtroom. It was about a pattern interrupted, a habit challenged by restraint. Footsteps approached behind her, then slowed. The judge emerged briefly into the hall, nodding once in acknowledgement before continuing on, his expression thoughtful, burdened by responsibility rather than pride. Alyssa returned the nod, respectful, composed. There was nothing more to say. The system had spoken for itself when given the chance. Down the corridor, Officer Daniel Whitmore stood with another official, his posture subdued, his attention fixed on the floor as instructions were quietly reiterated. He did not look toward Alyssa. She did not look toward him. The distance between them was no longer physical, but ethical, defined by choices rather than proximity. Alyssa turned and walked toward the exit, her pace unhurried, her presence calm. As she passed through the building's heavy doors, the air outside felt different, lighter, carrying the muted sounds of the city beyond the courthouse steps. Cars moved steadily along the street. A bus hissed as it pulled away from the curb. Life continued, unaware of the subtle correction that had just taken place within the walls behind her. Alyssa descended the steps slowly, aware of the eyes that followed her, not with suspicion now, but with something closer to understanding. She did not acknowledge them. She had never sought their approval. She moved forward, grounded in the knowledge that dignity did not require an audience. At the bottom of the steps, she stopped briefly, taking in the rhythm of the city, the ordinary movement that so often masked extraordinary moments. She reflected on the choice she had made to remain silent when noise would have been easier, to remain composed when reaction was expected. She knew that silence, when chosen deliberately, could be a form of accountability. It forced others to confront themselves without distraction. It denied them the comfort of chaos. Alyssa adjusted her coat and continued walking, blending into the flow of people, no longer distinct, no longer central. Yet the impact of her presence lingered behind her, woven quietly into the record, into the memory of a courtroom that had been forced to pause and listen. She understood that justice did not always arrive with force or volume. Sometimes it arrived through patience, through the refusal to surrender dignity, through the courage to let truth stand on its own. As Alyssa moved down the block, the courthouse receded behind her, its pillars casting long shadows across the steps. She did not look back. There was no need to. What mattered had already been set in motion. She had entered that room without raising her voice, and she had left it the same way. In the end, it was not her silence that defined the moment, but what the silence revealed. The truth had been loud enough, and it had been heard. The hallway outside the courtroom felt quieter than Alyssa Carter expected, the polished floor reflecting the overhead lights as people moved past her with subdued purpose. She paused near a tall window where afternoon sunlight filtered through, casting long lines across the stone walls. Inside the courtroom, the echoes of procedure and authority had settled. But here, in the space between rooms, the moment finally had room to breathe. Alyssa stood still, her reflection faint in the glass, and allowed herself a single measured breath. The weight she carried was not relief, nor triumph, but clarity. She understood that what had unfolded was not about one officer or one courtroom. It was about a pattern interrupted, a habit challenged by restraint. Footsteps approached behind her, then slowed. The judge emerged briefly into the hall, nodding once in acknowledgement before continuing on, his expression thoughtful, burdened by responsibility rather than pride. Alyssa returned the nod, respectful, composed. There was nothing more to say. The system had spoken for itself when given the chance. Down the corridor, Officer Daniel Whitmore stood with another official, his posture subdued, his attention fixed on the floor as instructions were quietly reiterated. He did not look toward Alyssa. She did not look toward him. The distance between them was no longer physical, but ethical, defined by choices rather than proximity. Alyssa turned and walked toward the exit, her pace unhurried, her presence calm. As she passed through the building's heavy doors, the air outside felt different, lighter, carrying the muted sounds of the city beyond the courthouse steps. Cars moved steadily along the street. A bus hissed as it pulled away from the curb. Life continued, unaware of the subtle correction that had just taken place within the walls behind her. Alyssa descended the steps slowly, aware of the eyes that followed her, not with suspicion now, but with something closer to understanding. She did not acknowledge them. She had never sought their approval. She moved forward, grounded in the knowledge that dignity did not require an audience. At the bottom of the steps, she stopped briefly, taking in the rhythm of the city, the ordinary movement that so often masked extraordinary moments. She reflected on the choice she had made to remain silent when noise would have been easier, to remain composed when reaction was expected. She knew that silence, when chosen deliberately, could be a form of accountability. It forced others to confront themselves without distraction. It denied them the comfort of chaos. Alyssa adjusted her coat and continued walking, blending into the flow of people, no longer distinct, no longer central. Yet the impact of her presence lingered behind her, woven quietly into the record, into the memory of a courtroom that had been forced to pause and listen. She understood that justice did not always arrive with force or volume. Sometimes it arrived through patience, through the refusal to surrender dignity, through the courage to let truth stand on its own. As Alyssa moved down the block, the courthouse receded behind her, its pillars casting long shadows across the steps. She did not look back. There was no need to. What mattered had already been set in motion. She had entered that room without raising her voice, and she had left it the same way. In the end, it was not her silence that defined the moment, but what the silence revealed. The truth had been loud enough, and it had been heard.